Okay, in chapter 3, the Isabel and Ruth are being sold to the Locktons because Mr. Robert doesn't want them. So Miss Lockton seems a little mean, but we'll find out. So this is the end of chapter 3. All right. How much do you want for them? Lockton asked. Mr. Robert named his price. Our price. 2 for 1. Us being sold like bolts of fabric cloth or chipped porridge bowls. Wait, Jenny announced loudly. Jenny is Mrs. Lockton. No, I'm sorry. Jenny is the girl who works in the like the restaurant slash bar, who knew Isabel and Ruth's mother. Wait, Jenny announced loudly. I'll take them. The table froze. A person like Jenny did not speak to folks like the Locktons or Mr. Robert, not in that manner. Lockton stared at her as if she had grown a second head. I beg your pardon? Jenny set the kettle on the table, stood straight, and wiped her palms on her skirt. I want them 2 girls. I need them. I need their help. We'll pay cash. Keep to your kitchen, woman. Madame Lockton's words came out sharp and loud. Did she change her mind? Will she really take us? I thought. Work in the tavern wouldn't be bad, maybe, and Jenny would be kind to Ruth. I could ask around about Lawyer Cornell's papers. When we found Miss Mary's will, I'd work extra to pay Jenny back for the money we cost her, fair and square. Ruth and me would stay together, and we'd stay here, close to Mama. Please, God, let this happen. Leave us, Lockton said to Jenny, and send your husband over. Jenny ignored him. It'll take us a couple of days to get your money together, she said to Mr. Robert. We'll give you free lodging in the meantime. Mr. Robert's eyes darted between the 2 bidders. Ruth yawned. I crossed my fingers behind my back. Please, God, please, God, please, God. Madame Lockton flicked crumbs to the floor with her handkerchief. Dear husband, she said, these girls are a bargain at double the price. With your permission, might we increase our offer? Lockton picked at his teeth. As long as we can conclude this business quickly. Madame stared at Jenny. Can you top our offer? Jenny wiped her hands on her apron, silent. Well, Madame Lockton demanded. Jenny shook her head. I cannot pay more. She bobbed a little curtsy. My husband will tally your account, and she hurried for the kitchen door. Mr. Robert chuckled and reached for his pie. Well then, we had a little auction right here, after all. Such impudence is disturbing, Lockton said. This is why we need the king's soldiers to return. He pulled out a small sack and counted out the coins to pay for us. I thank you, sir, for the meal and the transactions. You may deliver the girls to the Hartsburn, if you please. Come now, Anne. Madame Lockton stood, and the men stood with her. Good day to you, sir. Safe voyage, ma'am, Mr. Robert replied. As the Locktons made their way through the crowded room, Mr. Robert dropped the heavy coins into a worn velvet bag. The thuddering they made as they fell to the bottom reminded me of clods of dirt raining down on a fresh coffin. Ruth put her arm around my waist and leaned against me. Okay, so this is chapter 4. It's very short. All right, so this is Monday, May 27th through Wednesday, May 29th, still in 1776. It took 2 nights and 2 days for the Hartsborn to sail from Newport to the city of New York. Ruth and me were housed below the packet boat's deck with 6 sheep, a pen of hogs, 3 families from Scotland, and 50 casks of dry cod. At the far end of the hold were crates of goods stamped Lockton and Foote, and casks of rum with the same marking. I spent most of the voyage bent double over a puke bucket, bringing up every scrap of food and swallow of brackish water I choked down. Ruth stood on a box looking out of a porthole, counting seagulls and waves in a whisper that could barely be heard over the creaking of the hull of the ship. The seas calmed late on the second night, and I was able to walk a bit. Ruth was sound asleep in our hammock, thumb in her mouth. The hatchway to the deck was open and tempting. I climbed up the ladder slowly. The few sailors on watch saw me, but didn't say a word. The fat moon lit the water like a lantern over a looking glass. A clean, cold breeze blew from the north, pushing the ship so fast across the sea that we seemed to fly. I sat on a crate facing the back end of the ship, and hugged my knees to my chest. A mist of salty spray hung in the air. The coastline of Rhode Island had long disappeared into darkness. I could not see where we came from or where we were going. Maybe the ship would spring a leak and sink. Maybe we would be blown off course and land in a country without New York or people who bought and sold children. Maybe the wind would blow us in circles until the end of our days. I wiped the mist from my face. Mama said that ghosts couldn't move over water. That's why kidnapped Africans got trapped in the Americas. When Papa was stolen from Guinea, he said the ancestors howled and raged and sent a thunderstorm to turn the ship back around, but it was too late. The ghosts couldn't cross the water to help him, so he had to make his own way in a strange place, sometimes with an iron collar around his neck. All of Mama's people had been stolen too, and taken to Jamaica, where she was born. Then she got sold to Rhode Island, and the ghosts of her parents couldn't follow and protect her. They kept moving us over the water, stealing us away from our ghosts and our ancestors, who cried salty rivers into the sand. That's where Mama was now, wailing at the water's edge, while her girls were pulled out of sight under white sails that cracked in the wind. Okay, we're going to start chapter 5. And I don't think we're going to get through chapter 5, but we'll try. So this is Wednesday, May 29th, 1776. The Hartshorn docked in New York the next morning, just after a sailor brought down some old biscuits for our breakfast. I picked out the worms and tossed them through the porthole, and then gave the biscuits to Ruth. Madame Lockton's voice rose above the shouting sailors. "Bring those girls up," she said. A fellow, missing most of his teeth, stuck his head down the hatchway and waved us up over his shoulder. We climbed up, shading our eyes against the bright light of day. Men of all types and colors swarmed the deck, carrying casks and chests down the gangplank, scurrying up the rigging to tend to their sails, unloading gear, loading gear, and making me feel very small and in their way. Ruth stood at my side and stared so hard her thumb fell out of her mouth. The ship was tied up at a long dock, one of many that jutted into the river. The sun sparkled off the water so strong that I had to shade my eyes. Tall houses of brick and stone faced us, with rows upon rows of windows looking down at the street. They reached higher than the oldest trees back home. There were smaller buildings, too, all crowded shoulder to shoulder, with no room for a feather to pass between them. We had arrived soon after a heavy rain. Soldiers splashed through the glittering puddles, toting wood, emptying wagons, carrying buckets hither and fro, and standing about on corners, conversating with each other. Some wore uniforms and carried long muskets. Others, in homespun clothes, dragged fence posts to barricade. There were ordinary people, too, maids with baskets over their arms, moving into and out of the shops, and cartmen pushing their barrows over the cobblestones, calling out to each other and yelling at the dogs in their way. The working people were dressed muchly as we did out in the country, but there were a few gentry who stuck out of the crowd like peacocks wandering in the chicken pen. Some of the working folk were black. In truth, I had never seen so many of us in one place, not even at burials. A wagon drawn by two thick-necked horses stopped just beyond the end of the dock. Not far behind it came a beautiful carriage drawn by two pale gold stallions and driven by a stout man in livery with a three-cornered hat on his head. He clucked to the horses to walk on until he stopped behind the first wagon. The toothless sailor approached us again and pointed down to the dock where the crates and casks stamped in Lockton and Voet were being stacked. "That's where you belong. Don't wander off, or one of them soldiers will shoot you dead." He laughed as he walked down the swaying plank, We followed him with tiny steps, Ruth's hand in mine. As I stepped onto the solid dock, I stumbled. "There you are!" exclaimed Madame Lockton, coming around the stack of crates. "Be careful with that," she said to two deckhands carrying a fine walnut chest. "That goes on the back of the carriage, not to the warehouse." The men nodded and carried the chest toward the beautiful carriage with the golden horses at the end of the dock. "Pretty horses," Ruth said. A soldier at the end of the dock picked up his musket and stopped the two men carrying the walnut chest. There was a brief argument, then the sailors returned, still carrying their burden. "What is this?" Madame asked, as they set the chest at her feet. "I told you to put that on that carriage." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," the sailor said, "but them fellers say all cargo has to be inspected at the wharf before it enters the city. Order of some committee what's in charge here." "Inspected?" She lifted her chin. "Those are my personal belongings. They will not be inspected by anyone. I do not permit it." Master Lockton had been half following the turn of events while supervising the unloading. As his wife's voice rose, he hurried to join her. Master Lockton, "Now, dear," he said, "I told you there would be some inconveniences. We must be accommodating. Look, there's Charles. He'll straighten this all out." A second wagon had pulled up next to the first. A round, short man rolled off it and bustled up to the Locktons. "What are you doing here?" demanded the round man. "You shouldn't have come back here." "Lower your voice, Charles," Lockton said. "Where are the men I instructed you to bring?" The round man pulled a handkerchief out of his waistcoat pocket and wiped his face. "Washington's men took them all to work on the blasted fortifications. Oh, double blast! Look there, Bellingham!" An official-looking man in a somber black coat had stepped out of a building across the street and was striding toward our little group, walking stick in hand. He was followed by a thin fellow carrying a book near as big as Ruth. Behind him walked a slave boy about my height, whose arms were weighted down with a wooden contraption and a small case with a rope handle. The boy wore a floppy red hat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow, the blue breeches of a sailor, and a pair of dusty boots. Bellingham is eager to arrest you," Charles quietly told Master Lockton. "I told you it was still unsafe here. You should have waited." "Anne," Lockton fixed his eyes intently on his wife, "do not fail me, please." She gave a little nod. "Do you have a plan?" Charles asked. "Everything is in order," Lockton said. "Elihu Lockton," Bellingham called, waving his walking stick. "Come join us, friend." 3 more soldiers appeared and lined up a few paces behind him. "Smile, everyone," Lockton commanded through clenched teeth. "Pretend to be happy rebels." The Locktons and Charles walked to the land end of the dock. Ruth and me followed a few steps behind, little mice trailing behind dogs that were fixing to fight. The boy in the red hat set down the case, and fiddled with the strange wooden thing. There was actually 2 strange wooden things, a folding desk and a small stool. After he set up both of them, the thin fellow laid the book on the desk, opened it to a blank page, and perched on the rickety stool. The boy opened the case and took out a bottle of ink and a quill, which he set next to the book. He closed and latched the case, and then stepped back and put his hands behind his back, eyes ahead, like he was a soldier too. "Good day, Charles." Mr. Bellingham inclined his head toward Madam. "Mrs. Lockton?" Ruth stared to raise her hand to wave at the man, but I grabbed it and held it down. "Mr. Bellingham," Madam replied, How fares your good wife?" "Happy that summer is nearly here. You know how she hates the cold." "Yes, please tell Lorna I shall call on her as soon as we are settled," Madam said. "Very good," Bellingham said. "We thought you were in London, Elihu." "London? Ugh, never!" exclaimed Lockton. "England offers us nothing but taxes, stamps, and bloodshed." How odd. Word from Boston is that you still lick the king's boots." Madam drew in her breath sharply, but said nothing. I'm going to stop there because we're almost at the end of this. So they've landed in New York, and let's see if they are able to stay. Stay tuned.